Welcome back. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our panel on institutional retrenchment, growth in Latin America. Today, we're privileged to host two exceptionally accomplished experts in the field. Let me introduce them to you. First, we have Vanessa Rubio Marquez, a distinguished public servant in Mexico's government with a 25-year career in various high-ranking positions in public service. Notably, she has made history as the first woman to serve as a Deputy Minister of Finance, in addition to her social and development foreign affairs roles in Latin America and the Caribbean. Her expertise has been pivotal in the USMCA and the Pacific Alliance. Currently based in London, Vanessa holds a prestigious position as a professor and associate dean at the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics, associate fellow at the Chatham House, and senior advisor to McClarty Associates, where she shares her vast experience and continues to influence global policy discussions. Joining her is Jason Marczak, a renowned Latin America policy and development leader, serving as the Atlantic Council Senior Director of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. Jason's career is distinguished by his role as an adjunct professor at George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs, where he shares his expertise on Central America and immigration policy. His background includes positions in the Americas Society Council of the Americas, America's Quarterly Magazine, and Partners of the America, contributing significantly to civil society engagement and policy development. Are respected both in English and Spanish media, Jason has engaged with the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relationships and the U.S. House Committee on Foreign Affairs. He has presented his work on Caribbean leaders. Myself, I'm Julio, and I will be moderating this panel. Jason, could you provide us an analysis of the current state of institutional integrity in Latin America and its implications for growth?
Well, thank you so much, Julio and Vanessa. Wonderful to be with you on the panel, and congratulations to Dan Negrea and the whole Freedom and Prosperity Center for this really excellent conference. Really important to have these conversations and to do so on an annual basis. Actually, just yesterday, in this chair was Juan Gonzalez, who's the NSC Senior Director for Western Hemisphere, because we were launching a report yesterday, Atlantic Council report on redefining a new U.S. partnership strategy with Latin America and the Caribbean, a result of about a year's worth of work to try to meet the region where it is, right, and to try to find those points of synergy. Specifically going to your question, Julio, because of the concern about institutional retrenchment and because of the need for the U.S. to redefine some of the tools in our toolbox to make the U.S. an even stronger partner with the region, given the challenge that we're seeing. Are we seeing retrenchment? I'm going to give you a yes and no answer. So, I think Vanessa will talk in more in depth in Mexico, so I'll leave that to her. There's a couple. So on where are we seeing those real challenges to institutions? Well, I think. Of course, Nicaragua comes to mind. Nicaragua comes to mind because of Daniel Ortega abolishing presidential term limits, presidential candidates that are no longer able to run. Those who are in the opposition are either quiet or have been forced to flee the country in order to survive. Student activists, civil society, those voices have all been diminished, have been muted because of the threats in Nicaragua. Of course, similar Venezuela as well. The Venezuelan institutions have been absolutely decimated, and I think decimated might even be a light word, since Hugo Chavez first came to power over 20 years ago, and then Nicolas Maduro took over about 10 years ago. We see that right now. We see that there was the Barbados Agreement struck last fall, where Maduro promised for relief of sanctions to be able to allow for some type of degree of elections. The top opposition candidate, the one who's Maria Corina Machado, coincidentally, we hosted her yesterday as well at the Atlantic Council, and she came here to via video at the Atlantic Council to speak about the continued threats to her own candidacy and the fact that Nicolas Maduro will not allow her to run as the opposition candidate, despite the fact that he had agreed at this Barbados Agreement for allowing for some semblance of fair elections. So Venezuela, political voices, political prisoners, UN agency recently kicked out of the country, and so we see we can talk about Cuba as well, and that could be a whole nother aspect of our conversation. But I also I think that there's a couple other areas to highlight. One is Guatemala. I was just in Guatemala 2 weeks ago. We did a Atlantic Council event with the new president, Bernardo Arevalo, his vice president, and a number of his ministers. That was a real concern. His getting to power was a real concern. Part of the challenge in Guatemala is you have such a long period of presidential transition. He was elected in August, took office in January, and being an outside candidate, the forces, many of the entrenched forces did not want to see him come to power. And there were many that tried to prevent him from coming to power, including the actual day of his inauguration. The Congress, the vote was, I think, delayed about 10 hours in Congress before he actually assumed office. A lot of work behind the scenes to make sure that he was actually able to assume power. So important from the Atlantic Council that we came in quickly within a month of his presidency to really show that support from an international institution. So Guatemala is actually a case in the hemisphere where democracy and institutions work. Now, they were threatened, tremendously threatened throughout the transition, and there are continued threats to the president, but they panned out. I'll also just mention Brazil. Former President Bolsonaro had a huge rally in Sao Paulo on Sunday. Of course, we have January 6th here. There's January 8th in Brazil, where President Bolsonaro's many of his those close to him tried to subvert power with many acts in Brasilia against government institutions. What we saw in Brazil was that we saw the ability of the Brazilian institutions to remain strong and prevent Bolsonaro from trying to remain in power. And those institutions continue to be strong as new cases are put forth against Bolsonaro, and you see the strength of the Brazilian judiciary. So in sum, Julio, there is many challenges to institutions across the region, and institutions are continuing to be tested. However, there are a few cases recently where I can point to and I could go country by country, but I want to give Vanessa a chance here. But where you can show the resilience of institutions when those institutions are strong to be able to prevent those who are seeking to subvert them from overthrowing. The last point we need to think about when thinking about the strength of institutions is the real challenge of money coming in from transnational criminal organizations. TCOs are one of the biggest threats to democracy and to institutions across the hemisphere. We see that in Ecuador. We see that in Guatemala. Criminal organizations were literally trying to pay members of Congress to vote against President Arevalo from taking office. And so that is the narco politics is going to be one of the it is already a threat and will continue to be a growing threat across the region.
Thank you very much, Jason. Vanessa, and building on Jason's overview and taking into consideration that there are elections in Mexico this year, how would you position Mexico in this context?
Thank you so much, Julio. It's a pleasure to be here and to share panels with my friend Jason. Thank you, Dan. And of course, thank you to Joseph and to all the team here at the Atlantic Council and the Freedom and Prosperity Center, of which I am a proud member of the Advisory Council. So happy to be here. Yes, and I tend to agree with much of what Jason just mentioned. Let me just mention something in relation to the index and how it has played out in relation to Mexico lately and this year in the new Atlas. No? So Mexico is considered to be a mostly free and a mostly prosperous. No? So trapped in a somehow middle, not being able to improve both elements of freedom and prosperity. It dropped 5 places since 2018. It's below now Latin America's average, and the most acute falls you can track to the falls in the legal and political freedoms. So I'm going to try to explain a series of nuances and specificities around the Mexico's context, which I think is important. Mexico has administrations of 6 years. So presidents stay in power for 6 years. We don't have a re-election whatsoever. And having said this, there was a regime change in Mexico in 2018. And this is something that we need to understand. Why do I say there was a regime change? because there was a redefinition of the state within itself. There was a redefinition of the relationship between the state and the market, and there was a redefinition of the relationship between the state and the society. So the state within itself was redefined because now there's a new correlation between the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary, with much more intervention of the executive on the legislative, particularly the opposition, with much more intervention of the executive in the judiciary, particularly the Supreme Court of Justice, but not solely, and also the rethinking around the philosophy of the government. And in this regard, there has been quite a challenge to science-based approach, the technocratic approach that was discussed in other latitudes. And there has been a more binary sort of understanding of the state and the society, one in which polarization and populism play a large role, and one in which there has a certain flavor of canceling pluralism. So there's el pueblo, the people as a whole, no, without any nuance, without any specificities, and me that governs the country. No? So that idea of how populism is understood in the world and how this has become an authoritarian trend. When I wrote the piece for this year's publication, we didn't have by then a proposal that was set forth by the president just early this month with 20 constitutional reforms. And the 20 constitutional reforms include, for instance, getting rid of independent and technical institutions, no? That took Mexico 40 years to build. And these are the Electoral Institute in the one hand that ensures free and fair elections, but also the technical regulating bodies of the several sectors of the economy, but also the Competition Institute that guarantees competition, but also the institute that regulates data and privacy. No? So this is something that is happening in the country. But one, I think, should ask questions such as, why is this happening? Why was this something that was a reality in Mexico since 2018 until now? And there's a lot of reflection we need to do also, no? To look ourselves at the mirror and say, what failed? No? This morning we were listening to Acemoglu's presentation on democratic retrenchment and the correlation between institutions, democracy, and free trade and economic growth and prosperity. And there's a lot I think we need to analyze there. No, the institutions were there, but how well the institutions were performing, perhaps, is something that we should ask ourselves. And also, Kelly this morning in another panel was mentioning how we haven't been able to be successful in conveying the message around what is democracy, what should we expect around democracy, no? And what exactly would we find in the absence of democracy? Sometimes in the younger generations, they haven't seen the counterfactual. They haven't experienced what is to live under not democratic institutions, under not free trade, under not the respect of freedom and institutions as a whole. So I think there's a lot of work we need to do there also in sort of self-analysis in order to understand how we can build the foundations of what lies in the future, because of course there's a future, and of course we need to move towards a better stance in relation to democracy, in relation to sound and functioning institutions that give answers to the society. I think that's the problem now. The lack of connection, the lack of trust, no? There's some data from the Latino Barometro 2024 that I find striking, no? In the case of Mexico, this is 2024 Latino Barometro. When you ask the question of whether democracy is preferable to any other form of government, 35% of Mexicans say yes, no? When you ask, in some circumstances, an authoritarian government can be better than a democratic one, 33% of Mexicans say yes. When you ask, for people like us, democratic or a non-democratic regime is the same, 27% answer yes. So we need to listen more. We need to understand better. We need to engage in this polarized world. We need to understand the otherness, and we need to find answers as to how to construct the future we all want in relation to freedom and prosperity. So I'll leave my first comment here.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. So I think that there's a general trend on these cycles between, technocratism and then populism, and especially this is very pronounced in Latin America. In the 90s, we had this growth of the technocratic wing, where globalization was spread throughout the continent, and as Vanessa was mentioning, these people were very disenchanted with this trend. Jason, I would like to understand a bit better what are the root causes of this disenchantment, what are the broader consequences that it has brought, and what's the impact that this has not only in the region but for as lessons throughout the globe.
Excellent point, Julio. And actually, I'll say, Vanessa, on your comments on the Mexico and the Electoral Institute, I was in Mexico in 2006 as an election observer when it was Felipe Calderon and AMLO and that. And I remember being there, and the Mexican electoral, the observers, a lot of them were not there to see whether the process was fair, but they were actually there to learn from Mexico on how to carry out an election, right? From South Korea, Japan, all over around the world, they come to Mexico to learn because Mexico was kind of best in class.
Exactly.
And so far as the way that I always say Mexico, the electoral system in Mexico, far better than what we have here in the United States about the amount of kind of rules around it, the regulations, the way it's really monitored. Mm-hmm. And also really good point on the youth who don't see. I mean, Latin America and the Caribbean is the second after Africa, the second youngest after Africa, the largest young population, 18 to 35 in the world. And so a lot of people just don't know what the alternative is. Mm-hmm. So Julio, to your question, why should we care? And what are some of the principal causes, right? Well, I think why should we care? Some people might say, well, it's Latin America. Let's focus on other areas of the world. Well, I'll say that what happens in Latin America and the strength of institutions in Latin America is so fundamental for U.S. security interests, national security interests, economic security interests. For the obvious reason of we're neighbors, we share a hemisphere. I'll also posit that part of the ability for U.S. power projection globally, historically, has been the fact that we live in a hemisphere where we don't have to worry about threats from our neighbors largely, right? I mean, what other country really kind of lives in that such a secure neighborhood writ large? Of course, there are the communist threats of the 20th century, but by and large. Also, Latin America presents as an economic increasing, important. Half of our free trade agreements are with Latin America. The incredible mineral wealth that comes from Latin America, whether it's lithium, whether it's copper, all natural resources that are critical to the future technological needs and current technological needs in the United States. So really important that we have democracies and governments that are functioning well. And then also we see a continued growth in the region from geopolitical actors who don't have the interests of the United States in mind. And I'll point to the different ways in which Russia engages in the region through disinformation campaigns versus the way that China engages in the region through its continued attempts at economic dominance and dominance of some of these mineral wealth supply chains that are so critical for the U.S. future. So, frankly, we ignore Latin America and the Caribbean at our own peril. And this is, I think there's a growing recognition of the importance of the region. What are some of the principal causes? Well, one is I think that there's a general sentiment that democracies don't deliver, right? And whether they do or don't is a different question. But there's a general sentiment that the democratic system of government is not delivering to people. And what people are concerned about in the region is less about whether there's a democracy or not, but more about their pocketbooks. Is my life better today than it was yesterday, right? They're concerned about security. right? I mentioned before transnational criminal organizations, right? They're concerned about being able to go out there. They're concerned about extortion of their businesses if you live in Ecuador, increasingly, right? They're concerned about security in Mexico. A journalist in Mexico is worried about their security. So these fundamental issues, there's a disconnect between the population and whether they see the democracies that govern them as actually serving those interests. I think that there's also, a concern about the widespread corruption, right? And people see not all this, also kind of this questioning of the democratic model, but then also seeing the vast corruption that will exist, whether at the local level, whether at the national level. That also kind of then raises concerns about it. And I think it was only exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, right? Because COVID was a time when people were looking at their governments to quickly be able to deliver, right? And we, here in the U.S. or Europe or other parts, we thought it was a difficult time. It was a much more difficult time if you lived in, Ecuador or Argentina or pick your country in Latin America. And the medicine didn't arrive quick enough. There weren't the safety nets provided by governments to help people deal with some of the job fallout. I mean, it's a region where most workers are in the informal sector, so that provided an increased challenge because of COVID. So you have this, this has all kind of risen to then these anti-corruption populists that that you see across the region, right? Someone like a Bukele in El Salvador, right? Bukele in El Salvador a couple of weeks ago, received about 85% of the vote, right? But at the same time, this is the same president looking at institutions who had to massage the Constitution to be able to run again. And the same president, although the security situation has improved dramatically in El Salvador, the challenges to basic civil liberties have exacerbated. But Salvadorans saw him as responding to their basic needs of improved security. So some of the more authoritarian tactics that Bukele takes are okay by most Salvadorans. You see that by the votes. Because of the improvement that he's played on the security situation. So these anti-corruption populists, and then also the weakened institutions that are necessary to fight corruption and also to improve respond to some of the social demands across the region.
Thank you very much, Jason. Vanessa, so you were talking about the degradation of institutions in Mexico. You talked about the judiciary power. You talk about the Institute for Access of Information. What about good institutions? What's the resilience of these institutions? What are the primary factors that, on the one hand, allows these institutions to survive, but on the other hand, also, how would you identify those vulnerabilities between the institutional framework that Mexico has?
I think that's a very important question and goes to something that Jason was mentioning around the resilience of institutions. Institutions can resist as much, no? So first you have institutions that are being challenged, no, by the discourse, by the fact that their legitimacy is being questioned, their sole existence is being questioned. This populistic narrative around state capture and market capture of institutions. Then institutions are eroded. Eroded in the case of Mexico, there have been attempts to change the constitution, as the one I was just referring to, but also to change the legislation. And also there's some more subtle ways into challenging the institutions, such as budget. You have the budget, you reduce the budget. We are in an austere context, no? You pass from austerity to austericide, and then basically you do significant damage to the institution. Another way to erode institutions is governance, because governance is quite interlinked to the checks and balances of the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. in many of the institutions you have mentioned, it is the executive that proposes the member of the board of the institution or the commissioner, no? And then it's the legislative that makes a decision on that, and then they're appointed. Well, if I don't make the appointment in the first place and propose it to the legislative, they will never get the governance they need in order to operate. So I challenge their governance as well. So there's many ways in which this erosion has happened. But there are a lot of nuances. And here, again, I would tend to agree with Jason, because it is not black and white. Many of the institutions have resisted. Many of the institutions have been really backstops against this authoritarian challenge. For instance, the fact that the government doesn't have a majority in Congress has been essential not to pass those laws that go against democracy, that go against freedom, and that go against the institutions themselves. Another element has been a major institution which has been a backstop for all these anti-constitutional attempts to get rid of institutions, which is the Supreme Court of Justice. So we still have a Supreme Court of Justice that is a backstop there, again, with some challenges in the very short term in relation to governance, because some of the judges are going to be renewed in the near future, and that renewal of their governance also touches on the executive, no? The Electoral Institute, we still have an Electoral Institute that organizes free and fair elections. We can discuss how free and how fair and how that might be deteriorating, particularly in the current challenge of organized crime participating in the electoral process in Mexico in different ways. And the fact that there has been a policy around hogs, not bullets, that's the official name of the current policy in relation to organized crime. The electoral court as well. We also have an electoral court. As you were saying, Mexico had a whole infrastructure in relation to organizing free and fair elections. But also, if one wants to look at two elements, when we ask why are these leaders so popular, no, we have to see ourselves in the mirror and we have to see the facts. I would say, I would point to three elements in relation to the medium to low part of the pyramid in Mexico. Minimum wage in the last 5 years, so there's only 1 more year for this administration to end, less than a year. The minimum wage has been increased 85%, adjusted to inflation by decree, no? So people have much more financial resources. Second element that I would point to, if you were placed in 2018, the resources, the fiscal resources and the budget to social programs, to social transfers, was $8 billion US. Today, this year, an electoral year, I would underline, is 30 billion, 30. And also something not attributable to the government, but still having an effect on the population, remittances. And remittances were 34 billion in 2018, and last year they were 63 billion. So there you have an answer as to why these governments are becoming increasingly popular in some part. And I would point to another element that I spend a lot of years of my life in the Ministry of Finance, which is the Mexican economy has been quite resilient, and public finances still look good on the broader picture. If you see the broadest measure to analyze debt to GDP ratio, it's a very technical measurement, which is called the public sector borrowing requirements, and the historic PSBRs in Mexico are below 50%. The average in Latin America is around 72, 73%. So the big image of public finances look good, look sustainable, no? We have a prudent liability management. 80% of the exposure of the debt is denominated in pesos. We have a credit line with the IMF, where one of 185 countries that have that. We have historic reserves. We have a series of elements that in the picture look good in relation to public finances in Mexico, although this year they're running a fiscal deficit of 5.4% of GDP, which is the highest in the last 36 years. So deteriorating, but still a very resilient public finances, and a lot has to do with a question that is going to be essential for the new government that will be in power as of October 1st this year, which is what to do with Pemex. No? Pemex, the oil company, the national oil company, used to contribute to the public finances. Now it takes away from public finances, and that you can track to the idea of another trend, which is statization. This is another element that is essential to understand in relation to what's going on in Mexico. Statization of a series of elements, statization of economic activity, mainly in the energy sector, and finally, another element that I would like to point out, which is militarization. Militarization not only of security, but militarization of ports and airports, and the military is building the refinery. The military is building the Maya train. The military now owns a commercial airline. So this has been a trend that has been increasing over the last 5 years, sometimes more subtle, sometimes more evident, but that is challenging democracy, institutions, transparency, accountability, because the military is a security part of the cabinet, and they don't necessarily stand by the standards of transparency and accountability as it is the requirement in the rest of the government. So all of this mix, just to put how complex this analysis is, how there's positives and negatives, and how all the nuances help us explain as to why you have a very popular president, how there are a huge set of challenges in relation to democratic retrenchment, but also some elements that have been backstops against these trends, and an economy that is still resilient and that has been growing significantly over the last quarters, although the general GDP growth for the whole administration is only 1%. Way below our potential.
Yeah. And can I ask a follow-up to that? So it seems to me that increasingly a strategy for authoritarianism is to erode all of these institutions by slowly replacing the public civil servants. For instance, in a very close example in Mexico, and the former Minister of Finance of Mexico, Carlos Ursúa, used to mention this, and actually this is the actual reason why he quit, because people that were not prepared were just imposed into these institutions slowly and strategically. So we may not be talking about a lot of institutions coming down very quickly, but rather institutions being eroded. Can I ask, what are your predictions for Mexico in terms of institutional stability and about this erosion of the institutions for the next, let's say, 6 years, and maybe venture in terms of what you think about the administration that might come into the next election, and their ability to either keep institutions alive or continue to erode them?
I think that's the key question that the new president of Mexico will have to solve. And I would say she, because it's going to be a she for sure, that we know. The two main candidates are women for the first time in the history of Mexico. So I would say that is a definition that they will have to make. As I was saying, if you were standing in 2018, there was a definition that was made in relation to a new regime, and a new regime with a new conception of state, with a new conception of government, with a new conception of the relationship with the market, and with a new conception in relation to the society as a whole. So what kind of state does the new government aim to have? what kind of checks and balances in relation to the executive, the legislative, the judiciary, the independent and technical institutions. Those are the key questions that we need to ask the candidates because the proper campaigns start on March the 1st. So this is a first question that they need to answer and they need to propose to the Mexican electorate. There are a series of governance challenges that regardless of who runs Mexico, they will have to face. And one of them, besides this very key existential definition, I would say that it is how to deal with organized crime. What are you going to do after the Hogs Not Bullets policy for 6 years? No? And the huge power that organized crime has gained in Mexico. So you will have to have that definition of the first governance challenge. No? The second one, I would say, is Congress. They will have a very complex Congress in relation not only to the opposition, but their own coalitions, no? Having, in the one hand, the three parties, the most important parties in Mexico, being in a single coalition for the first time, no? There's a left-wing party, there's a center-left party, and there's a right-wing party. You would have to govern with that. How do you do that? That's a governance challenge, if that's one case. In the other case, you would have a party that is not a party, but it's a movement, and the former president being part of that. How do you handle that, no? So that is another governance challenge. I would also add the challenge of all the institutional retrenchment and democracy. How do you go along with that? How do you go along also with the military? The military, as I was saying, has gained significant power. What kind of relationship will the new government have with the military? Will you keep on giving them all of these spaces and activities in the economic front, or take that away from them? This is going to be also a very important governance challenge. And I would also point to something that is key, which is the relationship with the U.S. in the context of more migration, in the context of the crisis of fentanyl, in the context of what I call nearshoring 2.0, because we already had the nearshoring 1.0, which was called NAFTA and which was called USMCA. That was the first wave of nearshoring since the 1990s in Mexico. But we have a new wave of nearshoring. So if we want to make the most out of our competitiveness about being North American, about being the first trading partner of the U.S., the first source of imports to the U.S., one of the first 5 trading partners for 35 of the 50 states in the U.S., if we want to make the most out of this, then we need to redefine our competitiveness, our productivity matrix, our growth matrix, and the relationship with the United States as well.
And Jason, talking about this relationship with the United States, it seems to me that we have a lot of flavors in terms of, like the degrees of authoritarianism that we are seeing in Latin America. On the one hand, we have the likes of Bukele, for instance, or the recent transformation of what seems to be giving a very dark turn in Ecuador. Mm-hmm. On the other end, we have governments that, like the government in Uruguay, like the government in Chile, which cannot be, by any reasonable measure, characterized as authoritarianism. It seems to me that all of these flavors emerge because now we have a menu to choose from, which, like for the alliances that we are actually forming. We can just go, as a Latin American country, we can just go and pick China, pick some model of authoritarianism, rather than the Western model, if we like to call it like that, or we can call it, or we can just go and pick the Western model. Now, let's call it, we have a menu as Latin America from which to pick. What do you think should be the strategy for, like the non-authoritarian model to prevail ultimately?
Julio, when you said flavors, I started thinking ice cream, and I was thinking cookie dough or chocolate mint or whatnot. When I look, what you have in the region is you have straight up authoritarian leaders, right, like Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, or Ortega in Nicaragua, of course Cuba. And then you have, authoritarian leaders who are cloaked as democratic leaders, right? Or that kind of the democratic cloaking, and then you have other countries. You mentioned Chile and others where, Chile is a great example, right? It's a great example of a country where there is work, across ideological spectrum. The tragic passing a couple of weeks ago of former President Sebastián Piñera, who actually received a award for his environmental work from the Atlantic Council about 5 years ago. But his passing, at the funeral, you had all the, living Chilean presidents who were in the physical condition to be there across different ideologies to come, and there's a photo next to the former president's casket. And so you have, President Boric in Chile has shown himself to be kind of what could be kind of the new trend of what kind of a new leftist leaders the pragmatic, leader from the left could present. What could be done to strengthen institutions, right? And where are there those opportunities? We have 6 minutes. I have six points. No, I'll make them a little quicker. But I think so 6 things to strengthen institutions. One is, I think that to really, this goes to the work that we just released yesterday. We need to really strengthen the U.S. partnership with the region. We need to meet our partners in the region not with rhetoric, but with actual deliverables as well, because that is the new reality, right? Because China comes and they have money on the table. They have specific things that they're willing to offer, and of course, the U.S. values need to be continued to put forward, but also specific things, things like the Development Finance Corporation, right? The way the BUILD Act is written is, there's only a handful of countries across Latin America who qualify for DFC financing. Does that make sense? No, because they're mostly qualified as middle-income countries. So things like some of our toolbox the U.S. toolbox needs to be updated and adapted so that we can be a stronger partner with the region. There needs to be a greater focus on reducing corruption, and as Vanessa was mentioning in the case of Mexico, decreasing corruption and increasing transparency. My concern is that as you have increased, again, Chinese economic interest in the region, China doesn't have a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, right? China, the nature of the way in which Chinese investment comes into the region, even if the initial intention is not to perpetuate corruption, the way in which the investment comes can help to lead to greater corruption. And so we need to reduce that corruption. I think on those lines, things like incorporating technology more into governance is a way to be able to show transparency in governance, a way to make government processes more efficient, and to show that democracies are actually delivering. Education is absolutely fundamental. An educated labor force will allow us in Latin America to ensure that this newest technological revolution doesn't leave the region further behind and leave the region more unequal than it currently is. More economic opportunities. There needs to be more opportunities for formal labor force creation, and overall greater inclusion. Right, the difference between the haves and the have-nots across this hemisphere has only increased in prior years. As that divide continues to increase, there will be greater threats to institutions and a greater sense that the form of government that is the best form of government that we know, there will be a greater concern about whether those democratic governments are actually able to deliver.
And very quickly, a question for both of you. We have to answer really in 1 minute. So it seems that Latin America is destined not to leave the middle income trap. What do you think are the prospects for growth in Latin America?
I think what's going to be incredibly important is to improve on the value chain, right? And so there's a huge opportunity. Brazil is an agricultural provider to the world. Argentina has incredible agricultural oil and gas potential. Other countries have that potential. Guyana, for example, discovering incredible new oil reserves. I mentioned the lithium, Bolivia, copper, and Chile. But how the key is going to be these are all commodities that the world needs. So not just being an exporter of commodities, which is what we've talked about for quite some time, this is not a new discussion for the region, but how to improve upon that value chain to make sure that the higher end products are actually being delivered. We recently hosted a delegation here from the Dominican Republic. Dominican Republic is very interested in becoming a source for the semiconductor industry, right? So working in partnership to provide those opportunities can help to, at the same time, provide not only economic prosperity, but then also strengthened democratic institutions.
And Vanessa, what do you think about Mexico's prospects?
Very, very briefly, I think that there's a global trend in relation to geopolitics in the one hand, presenting challenges, but also opportunities, no, in what is happening in the world. In relation to Latin America, in relation to Mexico, there is this nearshoring trend that I was referring to. At this point in time, in the case of Mexico, much more an expectation effect rather than a concrete materialization effect, but is moving towards that direction. But we need to understand the very contextual growth determinants in each of the countries. What will make Mexico leave that middle income trap? What would create more solid foundations, more productivity, more competitiveness in order to be able to grow to potential, not 1%, but 4%, no? And that is clear. It has to be the rule of law. It has to be access to social rights. We were one of the countries that first introduced the multidimensional measurement of poverty. We have that policy anchor, and that policy anchor is food and nutrition, education, housing, services to housing, health, infrastructure. We need to abide to that standard and that anchor in order to create good public policy. But we will not be able to create good public policy if we not solve first the need to have solid, functional institutions that deliver. If institutions do not deliver, then democracy will always be seen as something hybrid, as something ethereal that is not bringing a positive change for families and positive change for individuals.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Ladies and gentlemen, this was our panel on institutional retrenchment and growth in Latin America. I will pass the baton back to Dan. Dan, back to you.